Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Ms. Joy Mosley, who's the Associate Vice President of Government and Strategic Relations Council for the Christian Colleges and Universities. We also have with us Dr. Andrew Polk, a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We have with us Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and University of Maryland professor of public policy. And we have with us Dr. Wilmer Leon, nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. Great having you guys here with us and looking forward to our show. You know, we've been hearing a lot of stuff regarding anti-Christian bias and a lot of activity that's been coming either out of the White House or other federal agencies. And recently, the VA secretary launched a task force that's targeting anti-Christian bias at the agency. The Department of Veteran Affairs is putting together this group with the goal to identify and eliminate anti-Christian discrimination at the agency. The task force is looking to collect reports from employees on actions, activities that are deemed hostile to Christian views and values. And according to an internal memo, the secretary is trying to ensure that he, who is a pastor and he's a former Air Force Reserve chaplain, wants his employees to understand that we are focusing on Christian values because that is the mandate from President Donald Trump. You know, when I take a look at all of this activity going on and wondering how on earth are we going to really push Christian values and don't push anything else, but when you have the president who's putting out an executive order pushing in that direction, what else can you do? You know, when you hear this type of activity and you wonder where you should go, where do you think we should go with all of this, and how do we decide whether we're going too far or not?
Well, I think we've actually gone too far. You know, we look at the military, and throughout this country, the military has been one of the few places where it's been open and tolerant. We've seen it push faster than society. Having grown up in the military, my dad did 30 years. I was in the reserve. The one thing that we're very clear about is that, you know, this is a solution searching for a problem. There's not anti-bias of Christian religion in the military in any facet. What we do see is a reaction to the fact that the military has, especially over the last 30 years, become more broader, more accepting, and inclusive. And that has gotten some people, especially in the current administration, upset. And so now they're on this witch hunt, I call it, to look at this. I think Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut had it absolutely right. There is no anti-Christian bias in the military, and this is causing and trying to establish a religion.
This is an incredibly cheap way of trying to adhere to some campaign promises and trying to bolster his Christian vitae, so to speak, because I don't know how do you weaponize anti-Christian discrimination in order to so-called protect religious freedom? There was a reason that Jefferson talked about separation of church and state. It was to prevent the very type of action that the president is trying to promote. And this also, to me, seems to be analogous to what they're doing relative to anti-Semitism, weaponizing anti-Semitism to use it as a cause for their attack on the First Amendment. And that in and of itself is anti-Semitic. This also, I think, ties to Steve Bannon's deconstruction of the administrative state. Because again, this is a direct attack on the Constitution. And I have not heard in all of this the administration providing any evidence that there has been any anti-Christian bias in the VA. And final point, I wonder how much of this has to do with Trump remember what he said about Senator John McCain, calling McCain a loser because he said, I don't like people who were captured. Well, I guess you don't like veterans who were injured.
You know, Joy, when you hear this type of activity about anti-Christian bias and being somebody who's always looking to work with colleges and universities to make sure that values are maintained, it does seem that there still has to be this balance that we have to look for to make sure that we're not over-promoting any particular religious institution.
Sure. I think I take a little bit of a different approach because representing Christian colleges, I actually do see problems with religious freedom and anti-Christian bias. I'm not as familiar with issues in the VA sector, but in education and social services funding and the ability to hire and those things, there are some real problems that should be addressed. We want to make sure that we're talking about religious freedom, not just anti-Christian bias, because religious freedom is for all faiths, not just the Christian faith. And so when we've been asked by agencies to share some instances where we've run into some religious freedom problems, the problems we've shared affect our institutions, but would affect other faith-based institutions as well. So we're trying to respond in a way that actually does share some issues that Christian colleges have faced, but they're issues that are going to be true across all faiths and religions, so that we're ensuring that we're protecting religious freedom as a whole, not just for our own faith.
I think that's the key, Joy, of exactly what you just said, and the clear evidence that this is symbolic and I would say nonsensical, right? If the issue is religious discrimination and they believe that there's some aspect of religious discrimination in the armed forces, of course, the anti-Christian aspect just gives the game away. And exactly as Dr. Leon said, this seems to be just a rhetorical aspect, right? That's a campaigning on the fact that Christians are a persecuted minority. Christians, by the way, who represent 2/3 of the American population. Even evangelical Protestants, if we're narrowing it to that, is 4 out of 10 Americans. I'm not sure persecuted minority really fits, but the language is helpful, politically helpful. That you are persecuted, they're coming to get you, be afraid, I'll protect you. That just seems to be the consistent talk here. And exactly, it is trying to find a solution to a problem that politically needs to be there to motivate a constituency.
Right. I think Andrew is absolutely correct. I mean, if you think about this, this is really going after those things they didn't like about the inclusion in the military over the last few years, whether it's women in combat, whether it's transgender, whether it's all of these things. And if you couldn't couch it under that term, but if you couch it on the term, there's anti-discrimination against Christian values, and that's what you're going to root out. You're really talking about those other things, and I think that's what they're trying to do in this instance. And they're going after one of the few places, as I've said, that has actually been more open than the general society.
What are Christian values relative to other religious practices? Because I'm Catholic. I was sentenced to do 12 years in Catholic school. I had to serve all 12. I've read the Quran. The values in the Holy Quran are the values that you find in the Bible. You read the Torah. The values in the Torah are so. When you start talking about Christian values, what that says to me is you are not including, you are excluding. And he's attacking other religious belief systems under the pretext of protecting Christians.
Yeah, and I think Joy was kind of leading into that. On one hand, you talk about Christianity, but you're hoping the bigger picture is you're really looking to help all institutions, from a religious perspective. And I'm wondering, Joy, if this is more a nomenclature issue where, bringing the word Christian in for some people is the only connection they have to religion, as opposed to not understanding enough that, I have friends who think that, that individuals who are Jewish are Christians, because they kind of tie this whole thing together. And maybe it's just part of the nomenclature or the lack of information. And I'm sure, Joy, you might run into that from time to time.
Yeah, I definitely do run into that. And I think it goes back to what we were saying about Christianity being a majority religion. So that just, it could be nomenclature for just capturing kind of the religious faith of Americans. When I've talked to a few people in these circles, they've actually, I've heard some people say anti-religious task force, not anti-Christian. So I do think it maybe, is a political term in some sense, but in some sense, I think that there are people who are really interested in that larger anti-religious bias, which, again, I would actually argue is not a solution in search for a problem. There is a real problem, and I'm hopeful that it can be addressed in a way that addresses all types of religious discrimination, not just against Christians.
Well, I think some aspect of this is you can't divorce this from other aspects that the administration is doing, both with the armed forces, right? That they're not disconnected. So in a similar way that the quote unquote anti-DEI movement that's going, that seems to be just blatantly more about racism and chauvinism than anything else. I think sometimes the language gives that away. For instance, in the terrible airport crash, right? Plane and helicopter crash. Well, why? Well, it's DEI. With the base understanding of if it wasn't a straight white Christian man, then it was because someone else got a job they didn't deserve, right? That it gives away part of the game. As Joy said, there is a real problem of religious discrimination in America that should be held and talked about. We have to keep vigilant, et cetera. But this does not seem to be that. I'm not sure. It's hard for me to believe that this was just rhetoric that just was thrown out, and what they really mean is a broad thing. That hasn't been the case in any other area. I think this is anti-Christian because he's going to protect Christians and Christians of a certain type who agree with him, right? I think that is the problematic aspect of this. It seems to be raising the value of certain individuals over others systematically.
This is one way how we know, as Rashern said, that this is a solution looking for a problem, because as with so many other talking points and positions that the administration takes, they offer no evidence.
Yeah, and I think one of the big issues is when you have one policy or an executive order that you try to just overlay over everything, that also is somewhat of a problem because, as Rashern mentioned, if there was ever a group that I would say has probably been more willing to be tolerant and probably came to the table earlier in terms of ensuring, to some degree, some equality, the military kind of went there first. The other component of this is you also have a VA secretary who is a pastor, who is a chaplain. And the idea of maybe that viewpoint was something like, hey, I can personally connect with this. I can personally connect with this. Therefore, I want my agency to personally connect with this. And it may be a little bit of personal activity going on. And Rashern, that's what I kind of felt his way.
Yeah, he's bringing his personal aspect into this and what he believes. And when he says Christian, he also means fundamental Christian. So it is once again their personal political beliefs that they're trying to put onto the military. And in this case, I think they're off base.
Well, I'll let that be the last word, but I think our hope is that what we're really looking to do is to fight those issues that are anti-religion and making sure that anti-religion activities get stamped out as quickly as possible, because we are a nation where it should be freedom for all from a religious perspective. There's a case called Rolovich versus Washington State University, in which we have Coach Rolovich, who's in charge of the football team, who is a practicing Catholic. He served as the head coach there for nearly 2 seasons, and he has earned a tremendous amount of respect for leadership, work ethic, and commitment to his players, both on and off the field. But a few years ago, he was in a position where he looks like he was being discredited because he was requesting a religious exemption as it related to COVID, and they were choosing to fire him rather than to accommodate him because of his religious practices. But you find out later on in this story that you have the board of trustees, you have the university president that had decided, you know what? we have a problem with this, Coach, and we are going to engage in what we would call the Rolo strategy to kind of ensure that even though he is requesting a religious exemption, that it should be denied. You know, Wilma, when I look at a case like this is one of those tricky areas where you try to go to court to see if a judge can determine how religious somebody really is. And it seems when we start to go down that road, I'm not even sure that's a slippery slope. That's probably just a straight hairpin turn crazy down the skiing kind of slope. I mean, where do we end up with this when now I've got to determine who's sincere about being religious and who's not?
We wind up with a mess on our hands that you don't want the court to have to be able to determine. Again, going back to the Constitution, that's why we're supposed to have separation of church and state. The first thing I did when I read about this story was I went and looked at Rolovich's record, and he's got a losing record. So that tells me this has more to do with their being displeased with his performance as a coach. Another point that I found interesting, I've never known, and I don't say this to say that it doesn't exist. I'm saying this honestly, I don't know that there's any type of Catholic doctrine in opposing vaccination. I'm a Catholic, and I've never heard any kind of doctrine saying Catholics don't get vaccinated. The other thing that I thought about in all of this is where we are right now with the measles outbreak in this country, and especially in Texas, with the ground zero being the Mennonite community in a particular part of Texas that did not get vaccinated. Vaccinations are a great thing. And, we had a disease, measles, that we thought we had eradicated. And now we find out that it is rearing its ugly head because a particular group of people chose not to get vaccinated.
Yeah, that's a real difficulty, I think, with the question that keeps coming up in a lot of these cases of what constitutes a religious exemption, right? And then the second aspect of it is there such a thing as a right to discriminate, right? Our religions, is there a religious right to discriminate that because of our beliefs, we can discriminate regardless of what the state says?
Sure.
I think here part of the issue is there didn't seem to be a lot of wrestling with that issue, right? I mean, it's a difficult problem. Certainly the idea of trying to figure out who has an authentically religious belief is just a fool's errand to some degree. And yet here, it seemed when they got to the point of revealing a lot of these internal discussions and memos, they wanted this guy fired. To me, this one isn't so much about religious exemptions. It's about they found a way to fire a guy they wanted to fire. I think it sometimes can distract us from some really difficult and complicated issues we have to figure out in the country of what do religious exemptions look like, and what can you exempt yourself from when it comes to public health and discrimination?
You know, Joy, this seems like this is almost on the other side of where you would find yourself in a lot of times. And when I say the other side, I mean, you're with Christian colleges and universities and trying to ensure where they are. Here's somebody at a public university who's trying to, quote unquote, advance what his religious beliefs are. And it's being thrown into a court to kind of determine, is this real or is this not real, when it seems like there's some underlying issues here. And I imagine, that's a battle that, in higher ed is a real tough one when it comes to religion and academia, how they come together and how they sometimes have to separate.
Right, it is tough. And I generally take a pretty broad perspective on religious liberty. So institutional religious liberty, but then also individual and religious liberty as in here. And it's, the court would get into problems if it entangles itself too much into religion by deciding, I don't think this person's religious exemption to me doesn't look like they really understand the tenets of this particular faith, or I don't think the tenets really say that. I mean, I think that gets pretty dangerous. And so we're tasked with what does that sincere religious belief look like? Sincerity is a test. It's an important part of it because you don't want people just claiming a political exemption, for example, and shrouding it as a religious exemption. But you also need appropriate deference because, like, to bring up Catholics, like some Catholics would have no religious exemptions to vaccinations. Some would argue about the aborted fetal cells, issue in vaccinations. And within denominations, you can disagree on those issues. And so it would be really inappropriate for a court to get in and substitute its own judgment for that of the person. But I think, Andrew made a great point here about there are enough bad facts here that under the masterpiece framework, we can actually say this is a problem. So masterpiece cake, the court found that there was enough animus on the part of Colorado to warrant, some of the concerns we saw in that case. And so here, I think we mentioned the losing record, which is a problem, is also one of the highest paid, if not the highest paid employees in the state, which is another factor. Plus, I think there were some facts where his supervisor had referred to his religion as a cult, and some other pretty bad facts, coupled with the fact that there was actually, Washington State had set up a kind of a human resources coalition that approved religious exemptions and medical exemptions, and had initially approved his, and then his supervisors came back and fought against that. In this particular case, there's some pretty egregious facts that would warrant an overturning of this case at the Ninth Circuit, though it does bring up those larger questions about how do you test for sincerity in a way that provides appropriate deference, but doesn't want to eliminate any distinction between what's an actual religious exemption and what's really a political philosophy that you've adopted.
Yeah. And I think one of the big issues, and Rashawn, this is where I think it gets really tricky. And I think Joy brought up the point that we should be visualizing people's religious views in the broadest way possible. The idea that I can hear what you have to say and want to shrink it down based on what your beliefs are. There's a concept where people say, my body is the temple of God, and what I put in it, that's part of the way I have my own religious viewpoints. And in this particular case, the ability to tell somebody that, one, we're getting rid of you, two, you got an exemption from HR, but three, we're getting rid of you anyway. And to say that it has something to do with your religion, or we think that you're not sincere from a religious standpoint, who gets to tell somebody who's sincere and what they actually believe?
Exactly. And I think that's the problem here. It's clear they wanted to get rid of this guy. I think Wilbur started off talking about, the fact that they were going to find a reason, and probably the biggest reason is that he was losing football games. But the problem for us and for society is that they attack the fact of his sincerity about his religious beliefs. And that's always a tricky and slippery slope for us to be on, whether it's the administration or whether it's the courts that are deciding that what is sincere. You made a good example, Orlin, talking about my body is my temple. There are a lot of folks who believe that, and it's part of their religious belief that, they're taking care of it, whether what they put in their body has an impact and is an outward show of their faith. I think they provided us with a problem here because they attacked it as part of his sincerity about his religion, rather than going and saying, you just suck at your job and we want to get rid of you. And I think they put us in a position where the courts, I think, will look at this and if they're doing it on sincerity, probably will overturn it.
But is there a difference between saying I'm a Catholic and against vaccinations versus because I'm a Catholic, I'm against vaccinations? So when you say to the court, because I'm Catholic, I'm against vaccination, then as a judge, I'm not testing the sincerity of your faith. I want you to show me some doctrine to support your argument. And if you can't show me support documentation, doctrinaire or doctrinal support for your argument, you have no argument.
Yeah, I think part of how this is going to turn out is interesting. So the late 19th century, Reynolds v. United States, I think, 1879. This was a case about a man from the LDS Church, Latter-day Saints, right, Mormon, that he said that, well, it's part of my genuine faith to be in polygamous relationships, right? So this went all the way to the Supreme Court. The original test there was, well, is this religious? Like, is it authentically religious? Like, does it count as a religious belief because others don't have it? The Supreme Court came back and essentially said, in establishing jurisprudence, American religious freedom means you can believe whatever you want to believe. But once you start doing stuff, the law takes
This is different, yeah.
My interesting aspect of this that I think we're going to come with public health. It's not the same, but it's very similar of you can have an authentically religious belief that you want to do this. The difficulty is the state, the community has to decide, regardless of those beliefs, you are allowed to act in these ways or not, regardless of what your beliefs are. That is, I would say, an incredibly difficult thing to determine, but I think that's what we're determining, not necessarily, or what we'll need to do, as opposed to figuring out what people actually genuinely believe. I just don't think we can ever get there in any way. So the question is, regardless of what you believe, do we have community rules, laws, right, that overcome those? Traditionally, America has said, yes, that's the way we work. I think that's probably where we're going here. But man, I don't know which way that's going to go right now.
Well, I'm going to let that be the last word, but I will say this, that when we look at these type of activities, the reality is that no matter what denomination you may be, if I polled 100 people in your denomination, asked them what they did on their day of worship, I'd get 100 different answers. So the idea that we can make this as to know exactly how it's supposed to work, religion is still personal, and what you do is still between you and your God. Hey, Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, I have two things I bet you don't know that are connected. Did you know that koala bears have fingerprints? And not only that, if you were to put a koala bear's fingerprints on a paper, the human eye would not be able to figure out which was a koala and which was a human being. They're almost identical.
You win. I did not know that. Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, I don't know that I can top koala bears and fingerprints, but the Ukraine so-called minerals deal is not so much about minerals as it is about giving the United States an excuse to either stay in Ukraine or to give Donald Trump something to claim as victory when the United States realizes it has to get out.
Rashawn, tell me something I don't know.
I don't know if I can top either one of those, but the Capitol behind me, the state capital of Maryland in Annapolis, is the longest continuous Capitol. So even when they redid our seats in the legislature, it had to keep the same body there. So it's not been changed at all. That's why we're all crowded together.
Joy, tell me something I don't know.
Well, we talk a lot about the importance of the filibuster in the Senate. And did you know that the word filibuster actually comes from a Dutch term for pirates? Because it was initially seen as hijacking the legislative process.
Did not know that. Great conversation today. Really enjoyed our topics and what we talked about. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. But just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.